what I'm interested in talking about the new tabloid racialism is what many people have noticed, I think, in recent controversies surrounding Aboriginal futures, the nature of radical Islam, immigrants in Australian society from Africa and other places, the rise of gangs in cities, and more recent and specific controversies such as that surrounding the Aboriginal academic and activist Larissa Behrendt, her views on Aboriginal futures and her tweeting about TV shows. And above all, what's been one of the biggest controversies of recent times is the writing by the Herald Sun columnist Andrew Bolt on Aboriginality and whether Aboriginality can be assessed by skin tone, which is currently obviously the subject of some legal manoeuvres by a number of people, including Behrendt, who he's targeted. There's been many analyses of these sort of controversies, which I think many people find bewildering, confusing, alarming, interesting in equal measure. In terms of Aboriginal debate, relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. But what I want to do is go back a bit and look at some of the roots of the ways in which we think about race, the changing ways we think about race and culture over the last century, half century and more recently, and to show, I hope, that this is really not so much about Indigenous politics as it is about a larger politics of the West and the need that some people have to define an enemy of the West, an other to the West, in order to define the West itself and the way in which that's come under increasing pressure. So the idea came to be that 9/11 was not merely the expression of a radical terrorist group, but was the expression of a particular religious sensibility and of the failure of a particular religious sensibility. So Islam became not merely one, Arab Islam became not merely one civilization and culture among others, but in fact was treated as essentially a subnormal, a criminal type of culture and civilization. Something, the argument was, had gone wrong with Islam, and perhaps something was always fundamentally wrong with Islam. Now, of course, Islam is a religion and Arab civilization is a collectivity of different peoples. But what was interesting in this process was the way in which, even though it was being attached to religious and cultural categories, a new form of the old racialism was being smuggled in. The new idea that not merely could a whole culture be blamed for a specific event by a smaller group of people, but that something deep and originary within that culture and within that people was wrong, that it was wrong at the root, radically wrong. Radically other. And this, of course, provided the sense of an enemy, the sense of an other that could define the West in the wake of the 9/11 era. This was something that arose not merely in response to the 9/11 era, but was also a response to the collapse of the old enemy of the West, which was communism. So you'd had a decade of relatively sort of postmodern, if you like, drift in which the West was finding it difficult to define itself. Cultures like China were rising, increasing competition in terms of moving forward into the future and ways of life. Then you have this extraordinary event, 9/11, and from that event is created the whole notion of an irretrievable clash of civilizations, and that then propels you on not merely to dealing with the 9/11 and the specific causes, but into the whole chaotic adventure in Iraq and Afghanistan, which stretched on through much of the decade. And that then became a symbiotic relationship between that adventure, that projection of power by the West, and the need to define that enemy in increasingly racialist and essential sort of terms. So then we had the rise of people starting to talk as they had once talked of other alien peoples, especially the Jews, as some sort of enemy within. The Arab Muslim immigrants to Europe became not merely a group of people who may or may not be assimilating, may or may not be integrating, but some sort of fifth column, some sort of dagger pointed at the heart of European civilization in the writings of people like Mark Stein and Andrew Caldwell. In Australia, what we got with the rise of the expanded world of news media online, with the rise of blogging by columnists and opinion writers, was a veritable industry of that form of hatred and the necessary creation, the relentless creation of an enemy to be attached to whatever social phenomenon came along. So whether it was the complex issue of gang crime in an area like out of Sydney, whether it was crime associated with African immigrants in Melbourne, any individual crime by people who happened to be Muslim came to be seen as an expression not of social causes, cultural causes, individual evil or individual wrong, but of a notion, of a racialist notion, that this was an expression of an essential wrongness. The trouble is for this sort of formation, for this sort of process, was that as this was happening, the West's main projection of power, of purpose, of the idea of an innately superior West was falling apart in Afghanistan, falling apart in Iraq, falling apart with an event like Hurricane Katrina, which showed the leader of the West, the United States, to be relatively incompetent and indecisive, and ultimately and finally with the 2008 financial collapse, which showed that the whole system which underpinned the West was fragile, jerry-built, and the reverse of triumphant. Now, in many circumstances, that might have provoked a rethink among some people. In this case, it hasn't. What it has created with the racialist genie out of the bottle, the racialist way of thinking about enemies, about others that cannot be assimilated, cannot be dealt with, cannot be in dialogue with, has been a search for new enemies, for new others. And it seems to me that it's in that respect that the political right have returned to Indigenous people and Aboriginal people and to new ways of talking about Indigenous people. Comes the hour, comes the man, and the person who can talk in the most racialist way to date has been, of course, Andrew Bolt, who has gone where nobody else was really willing to go, into the very old, the very archaic notions of biological race, of measuring the colour of one's skin to see if they are in fact a member of that race, ahead perhaps of measuring their skull or counting their teeth. And it's interesting, it's very interesting that Andrew Bolt comes from a tradition that makes it easier for him to go into a point where many right-wing people even would fear to tread. Because Bolt is a neo-Calvinist. Bolt is from a Dutch family. His father was an itinerant preacher in the outback. And one of the interesting things about the neo-Calvinist church, which rose up in the Netherlands in the 19th century, is that above all it is concerned with the notion of purity. Originally of religious purity and separating itself from the Catholic Church in the Netherlands, but eventually that was rolled over into a notion of racial purity. And that, of course, in Dutch South Africa became the cultural roots from which apartheid sprang. And over in Australia, where no one else would really think to go, for someone like Andrew Bolt, it's an idea that can inform the notion that, of course, one should look at the purity of who is speaking as an Aboriginal and whether they're allowed to speak in that way. That would seem to me, that and the fact that that has not met more concerted condemnation from what you might call the sensible right, would seem to me to suggest that these processes, the process of looking for an enemy, of looking for another, of looking for a way to define the West, have got a ways to go yet. That this is a new process as the West becomes less certain of itself, as it loses its capacity to define itself through adventures like Iraq and Afghanistan. What becomes the dominant force is the search for new enemies. And that then becomes Muslims, it becomes African immigrants, it becomes Aboriginal people who dare to be from two worlds rather than a sort of notion of a noble savage Aboriginal.